Well, I came across something really interesting while reading Dream of the Red Chamber the other day. There's a famous scene about halfway through chapter 3 where Jia Baoyu and Lin Daiyu meet each other for the first time. They both seem to recognize each other. Jia Baoyu says so, and Lin Daiyu thinks so to herself. Though it's technically not stated outright, this is a reference to a pretty obscure story in the first chapter about magical moss rolling off a stone and helping a flower become human. Okay, so the rock is the premortal Jia Baoyu, and the flower is the premortal Lin Daiyu, and there's all sorts of imagery that describes the sort of people they will be on the earth. It's a really unique way of starting a story. Anyway, the two speak briefly. Lin Daiyu tells Jia Baoyu that she's learned how to read and has been studying the classics. And then Jia Baoyu, clearly flirting with her, offers to give her a nickname. This would be Pin Pin, a name that translates into English as frowner. Baoyu explains the name, and then comes a famous part where he gets upset that she has no jade piece and starts to smash his own. Well, that's how most people read this actually. Most people just sort of skip right through all the nickname stuff and go straight to the action. But we're a little different. We're going to slow down here. So there are three things that are happening here that are really interesting from a literary point of view, and all three of them are pretty difficult to convey in English. We'll start off with the easy part. Jia Baoyu creates a fictional citation from a fictional book. He's focusing on this character, dye, which refers to the black ink used by women in ancient times to paint their eyebrows. That is literally what he says here, though it's dressed up in mock academic language. And the book that it supposedly comes from, which I translate as The Comprehensive Study of People, Ancient and Modern, is entirely fictional. Now, the truth is that part isn't really that hard to translate, but it does give you an idea of Jia Baoyu's personality. So he's not acting erudite just for the purpose of being pretentious. He's teasing Lin Daiyu. It's an act of flirting. What Jia Baoyu says right afterwards, though, is the part that most people miss, and it's basically impossible to translate correctly into English. Without skipping a beat, Jia Baoyu says, 况着妹妹没见肉醋，取这个名岂不甚美? Well, if we're going to translate that literally, it would be, regarding this little sister, she has pointed eyebrows like a frown. If we gave her this name, wouldn't it be beautiful? Now, that doesn't sound all that remarkable in English, which is the problem. There's a linguistic concept at work here called language register. It's baffling, especially to ignorant Americans like me, since American society seems to make a point out of ignoring all linguistic register conventions. This is why you had people like former President George W. Bush deliberately use incorrect grammar in official speeches. In fact, even Americans who study foreign languages can struggle with this concept. When I lived in Germany 22 years ago, it was easier to overuse the excessively formal Z instead of worrying about the conjugation changes that came with du. And when I learned Korean, the casual impolite form, heje, was something we never studied in class or even practiced. But you know, the linguistic register really is important. You need to know how to talk with a waitress when you're learning a foreign language as much as you need to know how to speak with like the prime minister or whatever. If you're an adult, you can't talk with a child the same way that you would talk with another adult, unless you're in the United States. Anyway, what happens here is Jia Baoyu entered an extremely formal register of Chinese, hence the four-letter phrases and the classical grammar, plus how difficult it is to read out loud. Look at this phrase at the end, for instance, 岂不甚美. The grammar here is like something straight out of a Confucian book. If you look it up in Wiktionary, you'll see that 岂不 simply means something like, is it not or isn't it that? It's used to form a rhetorical question. But the thing that Wiktionary won't tell you is that qi is an archaic word that is basically used exclusively in archaic phrases. So when Jia Baoyu uses it in such a stylized sentence, it's almost like he's using these and thous when he speaks to Lin Daiyu. And the other English translators honestly don't try. Gladys Young renders this as Cousin Lin's eyebrows look half knit, what could be more apt than these two characters? A translation that might technically be correct but sounds strange and feels boring. David Hawkes, meanwhile, gets really wordy. She has this dye in her name and she knits her brows together in a little frown. I think it's a splendid name for her. The problem, of course, is that neither of these translations really gets to the flirtatious nature of what he's saying. He's not saying that this name is apt or that it is splendid. He's referring to the beauty of her eyebrows and to how the nickname really fits that beauty. And that's the third point, and that's the point that neither the Youngs nor David Hawkes really seem to have understood. When Jia Baoyu first sees Lin Daiyu, we're treated to a little descriptive poem. You'd better get used to poems like that on this channel because there's going to be a lot more where that came from. And it's also not just a Dream of the Red Chamber thing, by the way. In fact, all classic Chinese works of fiction use poetic descriptions just like this one. In fact, Dream of the Red Chamber is kind of unique because its descriptions are realistic, believe it or not. So if you get into Romance of the Three Kingdoms, you'll have heroes that are like 15 feet tall and made of pure muscle. If you get into Journey of the West, you'll read about Sun Wukong flying through the air, defying the laws of physics. Dream of the Red Chamber, in contrast, generally will limit its poetry to artistic expression, and it shies away from that crazy type of exaggeration. We talked about this line at the beginning in our last video, the description of her eyebrows being filled with qing, which really ought to be translated as emotion. But check out this sentence at the end. Xinjiao Bigan Duoyi Qiao is the literary reference that can be difficult to understand. Bigan was a legendary man during the Shang dynasty who insisted on telling his leader the truth even though it cost him his life. Anyway, legend has it that Bigan had 7 openings in his heart, or qi qiao. This symbolized him having extraordinary wisdom and insight. This phrase literally means that Lin Daiyu has one more opening in her heart than Bigan, or that she is even more perceptive and clever than he was. But then comes the real hard phrase, which is much harder to translate. Bingru Shizi Sheng San Fen. I translated it as, and she was 3 times more sickly than Xi Shi. But we really do need to back up a little bit to explain this one. And yeah, it has everything to do with her eyebrows and that nickname that Jia Baoyu gave her. I know that that sounds a little crazy, but just bear with me. So Shizi is another name for Xi Shi, who is probably the most famous of the ancient Chinese beauties. Now, most English sources on Xi Shi won't tell you that she was sick. In fact, it took me a little while to trace down where this came from. It comes from the Zhuangzi and the story of Dongshi. So those of you who know some Chinese should know the idiom Dongshi Xiaopin, which means to imitate others only to make a fool of yourself. So the story here is pretty simple. Dongshi is a name that Zhuangzi gave to a person he described as an ugly woman, and she saw that Xi Shi was heartbroken and that she frowned all the time and that other people thought she was beautiful. And so Dongshi decided to clutch her chest and to frown all the time. See, she knew that Xi Shi's frown was beautiful, but she didn't understand why, and she thought she could have the same impact on people just by copying her. Anyway, this is a pretty well-known story. I'm pretty sure that I heard it going back to when I first started learning Chinese like 20 years ago. But the point here isn't really the story. The point is this phrase at the beginning of Zhuangzi's telling of the story, which is Gu Xi Shi Bing Xin Er Pin Qi Li, or thus when Xi Shi suffered from heartache and frowned in her village, and so on and so on. But in other words, when we say Lin Daiyu was 3 times as sickly as Xi Shi, we're talking about Xi Shi's heartache, not necessarily an actual sickness. Bear in mind, however, that Lin Daiyu was actually sick, like she's physically sick. So you can technically look at this either way. By the way, we think that she probably suffered from tuberculosis based on the symptoms that come out in the book. Now that first line of the poem describing Lin Daiyu refers to her eyebrows, that they looked like she was frowning even when she wasn't frowning. This is a direct reference to the beauty of Xi Shi, who frowned in the village. In fact, this character right here, Pin, can also be written as Pin. They both sound the same and mean the same thing, to frown. Sorry about this if you haven't learned Chinese before. I know that this might seem really surprising, but the truth is that Chinese, especially classical Chinese, frequently will use variant character forms like this. So you have 2 characters that to you and me look different, but they're actually the same, which is weird. The 2 don't look the same, they're actually the same character, and now you know why I spend so much of my free time studying this stuff. Anyway, that nickname, Pin Pin, is literally Jia Baoyu comparing Lin Daiyu to the most beautiful woman in classical Chinese lore, who was Xi Shi. That's why she doesn't get upset when he calls her frowner. In fact, you can see this near the end of the 3rd chapter when Lin Daiyu talks with Jia Baoyu's maid Shi Ren. Lin Daiyu had just been crying, and that's another thing we're going to have to get used to, by the way. Anyway, when Shi Ren asked why, Lin Daiyu talked about how Jia Baoyu had tried to smash his jade and said nothing about the nickname that he gave her. And that's got to be absolutely puzzling to modern audiences. I mean, what kind of nickname is frowner anyway? But if you know the classical reference, it makes sense right away. And author Cao Shuiqin's audience absolutely would have known this reference right away. One more thing, Xi Shi's frown was actually fake. Lin Daiyu's sadness, however, is real. Remember, she just lost her mother and she's living in a strange place. And all of this is foreshadowing of things to come. With a name like Pin Pin, the reader should know that things are not going to end up well for Lin Daiyu. But we'll get into all of this later on. Anyway, this shows you why you need a pretty comprehensive commentary to understand what's going on in Dream of the Red Chamber. So without this context, you would not only miss out on the flirting, which is cool stuff, but you also miss out on that crazy compliment that Jia Baoyu gave Lin Daiyu. Anyway, talk to you guys next time.